Hi, welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be video number 5 in a series about getting started in humanistic psychology, where we'll be looking at some of the basic vocabulary, ideas, and the basic gist of the whole enterprise of humanistic psychology. So, in our last video, we were looking at 2 layers or levels of meaning, the way humanistic psychologists conceive of it, in a phenomenological way. Okay, so if you don't know what that word means, you might want to turn back to the previous video in this series. At any rate, this video is going to be about how humanistic psychology seeks both to understand and ultimately to change life, which of course is a big theme from the previous video. And the answer is going to be by way of psychological research, and if you watched the previous video, you can probably already anticipate that this is going to be about a qualitative mode of research, or to put it in the usual sort of short language, qualitative research. Okay, so because humanistic psychologists see things holistically and consequently see reality as we know it in a monistic type way, in terms of a monism of both subjectivity and objectivity interrelating to each other, because they see things that way, in theory, any kind of research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, could be done under the rubric of humanistic psychology. Hopefully that makes sense to you if you understood what we've been talking about in terms of holism. So there's nothing in principle keeping a humanistic psychologist from engaging in quantitatively oriented, that is to say numbers oriented research. But the fact of the matter is that in practice, the vast majority of psychological research done under the aegis of humanistic psychology is qualitative in nature. I'd say that 90% of it is qualitative and only maybe 10% is primarily quantitative. And so the obvious question is, well, why would that be if humanistic psychology admits both qualitative and quantitative approaches into its ambit? Well, the reason has to do with a kind of systemic imbalance that has occurred in probably particularly American psychology over the past, at least 50 years, longer than that, more like 80 years or something like that. All right, and the imbalance goes something like this, that for the most part, things have been extraordinarily, exceedingly quantitatively oriented within American psychology at the expense of the more qualitative oriented approaches. So really, the fact that humanistic psychologists engage in qualitatively oriented research about 90% of the time, I'm estimating, has to do with trying to address that imbalance within the larger corpus of psychology as we've known it for the last, I would say 100 years in the United States, so let's up the ante there for a second. So the reason why they do that is to try to counterbalance the deficit of qualitatively oriented research within psychology as a whole, and not because humanistic psychology demands in principle that psychological research be conducted in a qualitative way 90% of the time. Okay, so that might be a contradiction you sort of, or a tension you kind of detected previously. Okay, so I said that, great. Okay, so, all right, so let's begin to sort of characterize this research in a little bit more detail. So a phenomenological approach to psychological research takes people's everyday experience, the phenomenal layer of meaning, as its fundamental datum, and seeks to explicate the phenomenological meanings implicit in people's descriptions of their experiences. So all of this is using the vocabulary you hopefully absorbed in the previous video in this series. And if that thing I just read out of your notes makes sense to you, that's great, because you're probably well on your way to understanding the material in this particular video. So this particular video is going to be mostly about giving you an example of a particular type of phenomenologically oriented qualitative research. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is only one way of conducting that kind of research. There are many other possible kinds of ways of doing it. Discourse analysis would be one, for instance. But I'm going to give you a more sort of vanilla and representative example of how this kind of research gets conducted. So, I give you an example. Suppose a researcher is interested in finding out the phenomenological meaning or structure of people's phenomenal experiences, everyday experience, of recovering from drug addiction, which is a very common clinical situation within psychology. So, all right, so step one, this is going to proceed through a series of steps, and there's going to be a little bit of specialized vocabulary associated with each step. It's going to get a little bit technical, so be ready for that. Okay, so a researcher might first ask a subject. Okay, the word subject is going to be used to apply to the people that are the researcher is looking at. Okay, so the actual people. A researcher might first ask for a written description called a protocol from each subject in his pool of subjects that he or she is working with. Okay, so asking for a written protocol. So what's a written protocol about? A written protocol is asking the subject to write about his or her experience, in this case of recovering from drug addiction. Like, what is it? Here's a typical type protocol question, like, please describe for me the experience of recovering from drug addiction. Please describe what led up to this experience, the experience itself, and the aftermath, if any, of the experience. So that would be sort of a typical protocol question, and the subject then would be writing, who knows, several pages probably about his or her experience of recovering from drug addiction. Okay, so notice what we said in the last video is starting to happen here. The basic data are natural language descriptions of experience. So notice that, all right? So the researcher would then review each written protocol, one from each subject, and look for points of uncertainty and lack of clarity in it. When people write about their experiences, they hardly ever do so in a completely lucid, straightforward, coherent way. Okay, when people describe their experiences in general, whether it's written or spoken, but right now we're focusing on written descriptions. So it hardly ever happens that people are just, purely transparent and obviously coherent in their descriptions. So almost invariably, the researcher will be left looking at this written description and thinking, oh, I don't really know what this person means by that, this, that, or the other. Like maybe the person says, well, I found myself jonesing, and maybe, who knows, the researcher doesn't know what that means. And so the researcher would have to go back and ask the subject, what do you mean when you say you found yourself jonesing? All right, so jonesing, in case you don't know, this means suffering like withdrawal effects, having to do with withdrawing from drug addiction. Okay, so wanting the substance, whatever it happens to be. All right, so the researcher identifies these points where there's a lack of clarity or seemingly a lack of coherence, or the researcher just doesn't know what the subject is trying to say. All right, so he goes through and identifies these points and formulates questions about each point of uncertainty. So the next stage is that the researcher would conduct a live interview with the subject, asking about each of these points where there's a lack of certainty or a lack of clarity or a lack of coherence or something like that, and asking the person to respond in a live response that's taped or recorded. Taped, what an old metaphor. That's recorded, about these points of uncertainty. Okay, so then the researcher would go home and transcribe this recording and integrate in what the subject is saying about each of these points of uncertainty into the written protocol. Okay, so that ultimately what results from that process is a kind of an integrated version of the written protocol along with the live interview, and that is called an edited synthesis. All right, so an edited synthesis. Now this is going to be the massive data, in essence, that the researcher is going to be analyzing. Thus far, all we've been talking about is acquiring the data. the qualitative data. All right, so it's going to be crystallized in the form of this thing called an edited synthesis. All right, so okay, so the first actual moment of analysis of this edited synthesis is going to have to do with identifying the so-called meaning units. In other words, the kind of blocks of meaning, or the building blocks of meaning that ultimately make up this edited synthesis. So what the researcher does is note points where the meaning is shifting within this thing. Okay, so when meaning, like the client is maybe the subject. I'm so used to talking clinically that when I have to talk the research language, it's a little bit of a transition. The subject is talking about jonesing, and then maybe the subject then moves to worrying about whether someone is noticing the jonesing. Okay, so the first meaning unit would perhaps have to do with the experience of jonesing. Like I felt a little bit sort of shaky, and I felt a little bit uncertain, and who knows what the subject is going to say. And then maybe the subject then goes on to say, and I started worrying whether anyone was going to notice this. Okay, so that point of shift between, here's the description of feeling sort of shaky and nervous and uncertain, then the next meaning is about worrying about what other people are perceiving. You getting it? So that point of shift would sort of demarcate two different meaning units. All right, so that would be maybe an example of that. Okay, so actually what you'd be doing is going through this entire edited synthesis, looking for these points of shifts, and then which would define the different meaning units that ultimately, if you add them all together, would constitute the entire edited synthesis. All right, so, okay, great. Like I put that example in your notes. I didn't realize I did that. Okay, so I'll skip through a few of the more, a few intermediate steps, because I just want to give you the idea of what this kind of research looks like. This is not sort of an in-depth class in phenomenologically oriented research. This is humanistic psychology, just giving you the idea of what this thing looks like. So after a few intermediary steps, the researcher would eventually end up producing what's called a situated structure, and there's going to be one of these things for each subject in the research sample. Okay, so each person involved in the research would have, for his or her segment of the analysis, a different situated structure. So one for each subject, and let's see how I described it here. Maybe that'll be good. So an articulation of the phenomenological meaning as it unfolded for that particular subject within the context of his or her lived experience. The researcher, in essence, is doing a kind of translation from the phenomenal layer of meaning of the subject's description of his or her experience to the language of psychology, right? So the phenomenal, and that language of psychology is going to be hopefully an articulation of the meaning now made explicit that was only implicit in the subject's original description. Okay, so situated structure. Now the next step is going to have to do with taking all of those situated structures, one for each subject, and noticing where themes are common across them. Okay, so what you'd really be looking for is themes that are common to everyone's experience of, let's say, recovery from drug addiction. All right, so you'd be looking for the meanings that are in common. First, the ones that are there in every situated structure, right? Or at least in most of the situated structures, because sometimes, you'll have, I don't know, like maybe, let's say you have 10 situated structures and 9 of them mention one particular kind of meaning, but the last one doesn't. Well, it's still significant that 9 out of 10 are mentioning that particular meaning. So when you locate the themes that are common across at least most of these situated structures, then the next sort of thing that gets produced is an articulation of all of those meanings, right? The ones that are in common. The ones that are in common. And that's called a general structure. And the general structure is the whole point of this particular research paradigm. So the articulation of all of the meanings as they unfold over time that are common, or at least reasonably common across all of the situated structures. So that's the general structure. So an articulation of the phenomenological meanings as they appear in all or most of the subject's descriptions of their experiences. Now, the last thing I sort of want to mention, I want this to be a relatively short video, hopefully. The last thing I want to mention is that something that maybe you've already noticed, that in a way, this research method is still being empirical, okay? It's still looking at something in the world, but it's not empirical in the usual objectivistic sense. And the reason why is because it's based upon people's reportage of their subjective experience. So it's empirical in a sense, but it's in a much more subjectivistic sense rather than the usual objectivistic type sense. Okay, so that's a brief tour through one of the variations. Like I said before, there are any number of others of this kind of research, but hopefully that's enough to give you the general gist of how it would operate. At any rate, that's enough for this relatively short video. I wanted this to be short because I didn't want to drag into the next massive material and sort of confuse you. So in any case, have a great day. It's wonderful. It's kind of hot here in Georgia already, but I hope you have a great day. Have a real good one. Take care of yourself.